Again, thank you for joining us for this month's webinar. And this is Odessa. I'm the Sales and Marketing Manager at Web Courseworks, and I am the host of this month's webinar. So let's get started. First, a few upcoming events and announcements. So Web Courseworks will be at ASA Tech Conference next week. We are going to be at booth 405, so swing by and say hi to Amber. And then we'll also be at the Alliance for Continuing Education in the Health Professions annual conference in January. That's going to be in San Francisco, California. Our next webinar will be in January 28th, and that's where we do our eLearning Hype Curve predictions for 2020. So here is the link that you can go to RSVP for that. Okay. All right, so now let's get on with our webinar. Today we are joined by David Rozsa, the CEO of Metacred, and a little background on David. So prior to founding Metacred, David led the certification departments of associations representing industries and professions as diverse as clinical research, construction materials, and financial services, consistently turning around growth slumps, enhancing legal defensibility, and empowering associations to advance their missions and increase their impact through standard-setting programs. Also, I just heard this morning that David will be the next vice chair of the ASA Professional Development Advisory Council effective February of next year. So congratulations, David. Okay, so now, David, are you on?
I am. Can you hear me?
Let's see. Okay. I will hand it over to David.
Hi, this is David Rozsa at Metacred, and it is my pleasure to be with you here today as we discuss the financial aspects of credentialing programs. I like to call this presentation How to Build, Operate, and Manage a Draining Distraction. And by the end of this session, we should share an understanding of the appropriate metrics for a credentialing program, some of the key decision points that we make when developing a new credentialing program that can have financial impacts, as well as some of the legal risks and other risks that we are exposed to in the standard setting world, and how to best manage those risks. So with no further ado, we're going to start off with just a brief recap of the terminology that we use in credentialing. Certification is essentially the independent validation that a person has demonstrated all of the knowledge, skill, and ability required to practice a particular occupational role competently. And certification is usually voluntary, but many certification programs have as an end goal, and several have achieved, either being referenced in government regulations or legislation, or being required by government in order for a professional to practice in that occupational role. Certification usually comes with an acronym title like Certified Financial Planner, for example, or Certified Association Executive, and always involves recertification. When I identify some of these traits of credentialing programs, I know some of us may have programs that don't share all of these traits. I'm basing these definitions on what the credentialing community has accepted as definitions. These are all available through the Institute for Credentialing Excellence, which has a great terminology document. So these traits represent best practices within each type of credentialing program. One of the key points for a certification program is that the validation is by a non-governmental organization. By contrast, licensure is very similar to certification. We're also assessing independently an individual's competence to practice in a given occupational role. But this time with licensure, the assessment and credentialing process is by a governmental entity. Otherwise, it's very similar to certification. There's normally a license renewal period. Often people who are licensed have the ability to use an acronym or title like licensed massage therapist, etc. By contrast, a certificate program does not assess whether an individual has all of the competencies necessary for an occupational role. Instead, a certificate program recognizes that an individual has successfully completed a discrete course of study. And that completion can be anything from having sat in a seat, attendance, or demonstrating successful knowledge transfer through an exam. A certificate program can be very narrow in scope, like learning how to use Microsoft Word to generate a mail merge, or it can be very broad, such as a medical degree, which is actually a certificate program, a discrete course of study. Normally, a designation or title is not granted at the completion of a certificate program, with the exception of academic degrees, which are certificate programs. And usually a certificate program does not involve any sort of renewal or recertification. Accreditation, on the other hand, is how we refer to the standard setting for anything other than a person in an occupational role. So this includes things like buildings, energy efficiency, processes, things like this. So those are the basic 4 types of credentialing programs. And of course, when we are looking to determine what success means, that can mean different things for different kinds of programs. For this presentation, we're going to focus on certification programs rather than certificate, licensure, or accreditation programs, but the same reasoning can be applied to those other programs as well. So let me ask the question and ask every participant to guess in the chat box how many years it should take on average for a new credentialing program to be financially successful. And go ahead and enter your guess in the chat box. And after you've done that, also, how many candidates per year should a program have once it's already in place in order for it to be financially successful? So we'll take a moment for everybody to enter their guesses here about how many years for a new credentialing program to be financially successful, and how many candidates per year are required for a program in order for it to be financially successful on an ongoing basis. Okay, and actually these are trick questions because the answer is it depends. And I apologize to all of those who are not lawyers or other professions that tend to answer every question with it depends, but in this case, that's the necessary answer. So let's go back and start with first principles. As an assumption, I'm going to assume that most of us who are participating in today's webinar are association executives and on the not-for-profit side. In that case, and even for the for-profit organizations like corporations running certification programs and the like, we really are all mission-driven. And how we measure success should always be within the context of that mission as an organization and for the actual credentialing program. To clarify, when I said not-for-profit, not-for-profit does not mean nonprofit. That's one of the things that really stuck with me from a class I took in law school on not-for-profit law. First day of class, the professor says, you know, how many here are interested in working for a nonprofit? And everybody who raised their hand, he said, okay, you really are in the wrong place. The point is that even when you're working for a not-for-profit organization, if your operations consistently lose money, eventually you're going to go out of business as an association. And so while we are mission-driven, while profit cannot be one of our primary motives, we have to operate overall at a net neutral or profitable position in order to continue to exist. And among all of the different programs and activities that are typical in the association world, from membership to conferences and congresses and exhibitions, trade shows with selling exhibit space and, you know, registration fees and membership dues and all of these things, advertising, publications, all of those things are great, but tend to be very susceptible to the economic cycle. Credentialing specifically, but also professional development as a whole. So education, courses, seminars, certificate programs, certification programs, accreditation programs, all of these things tend to be pretty well insulated against the dips in the economic cycle. So in other words, as the economy is doing really well, people pursue a credential in order to distinguish themselves from the many other people in that professional role. When the economy takes a downturn and people within an industry that is suffering financially tend to leave that industry, people are still pursuing certification, et cetera, as a way to demonstrate that they are there to stay and to reassure their stakeholders and to capture whatever remaining business there is. As an example, I worked at one trade association in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, and when there was an economic downturn and half of the staff was laid off and every section of the budget was suffering, education and certification was actually up 15% that year. So that's one example, but it tends to hold true across most associations. Ultimately, I'm going to assume that everybody on this call and most people in the association world desire financial self-sustainability of most of the programs and services that they offer, so that none of them are taking a loss. That there can be exceptions, of course, right? If an association receives a big grant and the expectation is that that program is going to lose money every year, that can be fine and acceptable. But the assumption for this presentation is going to be that we want our credentialing programs to turn a profit. And ultimately, in order to measure the success of the credentialing program, while we desire things like impact and improving the standard of practice in the profession that we represent as an association, ultimately one easy quantifiable tool to measure the success of the credentialing program is its financial success. So with those assumptions that we do want a credentialing program to turn a profit, how many years should it take for a new program to become financially self-sustaining? How many years should it take for that same new program to recoup the costs of initial development, the investment in developing the program in the first place, and how many candidates are needed each year in order for the program to continue to have net positive financial impact on the organization? And this time it's not a trick question. It typically takes about 3 years for a new credentialing program to start to be net neutral or net positive on an annual operational basis. That is to say, the revenue that the program brings in that year is at least as much as the expenses that the program costs that year, not counting the initial costs of development. So the second question then is, how long does it take to recoup those costs? And given the typical costs to develop a certification program and a lot of other assumptions, it typically takes 5 to 10 years for the program to make back the money that it initially had invested in its development. Now, I specified certification in that context. For certificate programs and accreditation programs, it's actually a lot shorter time to recoup the initial investment because the initial development costs of programs other than personnel certification are lower. And we'll get into the details of why that is. When we ask how many candidates we need each year in order to break even, that depends on a number of other factors, and we're going to delve more deeply into those throughout this presentation. So when we're starting a new program, we have some initial decisions to make. The basic one is, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of the new program? Every other decision that we make should be driven by that purpose statement, which is like a mission statement just for the credentialing program. If anytime we have a decision, we come back to that, chances are we'll be on the right track. The next questions after we have defined the purpose statement for the credentialing program are, what is the intended scope? Who are the target audience or audiences? Are we talking about a single credential, like a single monolithic certification, or maybe a framework that includes stackable micro-credentials, maybe a few certificates leading up to an entry-level certification with additional specialty certificates leading to an advanced certification with additional regional endorsements, et cetera, that lead to a master certification. One great example of this is scuba diving. PADI has a range of credentials that are all stackable and play into the chunking psychology of game theory and really get the people who engage with those credentials to pursue them more and more and more and continue to get new credentials, keep renewing their existing credentials, and stay very engaged, which is very successful for PADI. We also can look at whether we are talking about a single level or multiple levels of experience that we are assessing and validating through the credentialing program, whether we are certifying the core of practice and then adding on specialty endorsement modules. One of the most critical decisions in today's world, as global as we are getting, is whether a certification should be measuring a global core type of practice and scope of practice, or whether we are going with national level or regional level certification or state level certification in the US. And the way that we determine the answer to that question is, like most other things with a certification program, through a job analysis. And we determine at the front end whether the scope of practice for that particular occupational role is global, or whether there are significant differences in the way people competently practice the same occupational role in different regions around the world. If we find that the scope of practice really is global, and then all competent practitioners really need to have the same core of knowledge, skills, and abilities regardless of where they are in the world in order to do that job well, then we can think about having a global certification. And if there are then some differences beyond that global core, we can offer local, regional endorsement modules. Along with that, we have to decide whether there's a single language of practice. So do you need to speak, for example, German in order to be able to practice a particular occupational role, no matter where in the world you are? And if so, it would be a legitimate choice to offer the certification program in that single language of practice. Or can you speak whatever your local language is and be a competent practitioner? In which case, there's a strong argument that if you offer the credential around the world, you should probably be translating the exam, the applicant guide, the practice test, and any study materials, all of the support materials into the local language in order to be fair to candidates in that region. Finally, we would want to do a market analysis to determine what the value of the credential is to the various stakeholders of that occupational role, including the practitioners, their employers, their customers or patients, etc. We also would want to determine then, beyond the perceived value, what the likely volume of participation would be in the new program. As we're doing that market analysis, we would want to have quite a bit of data that, as associations, sometimes we do have and sometimes we don't have. We would want to know how many practitioners are there in that occupational role, everywhere, both where we are based and wherever we think we might want to offer this new credentialing program. If we don't have that data, one of the factors that we need to take a look at on the expense side as we get into the financial analysis is acquiring that data. We also need to define all of the stakeholders. As I mentioned, usually that includes practitioners, employers, the practitioners, customers, clients, or patients. It also includes things like government regulatory agencies, sometimes advocacy groups, sometimes business partners or suppliers of equipment or services to the certified occupation. And there are usually a large number of these sets of stakeholders. They each have different interests in a potential standard to be set for an occupational role. And it is, I would say, essential at the beginning of the analysis to understand what the stakeholder groups are and why they would care about there being a standard and a certification for a particular occupational role. what would be in it for them, what would they value. And then take a look at whether that new credentialing program can assess and validate those things that the different stakeholder groups would value. On the revenue side of our financial analysis, we need to be thinking about the rate of engagement, which is application volume for the certification program, what rate we anticipate that the program will grow in the early years and then as it matures, and what price point we should set for the program and its various sub-services. Typically, what we want is somewhere between 1% and 10% of the total number of people in the occupational role to apply for the new certification in the first year. That range of 1 to 10% is fairly large and depends on a number of factors. One of the factors is, of course, how many people are in that occupational role. Another is how many of those people are members of the association, or does the association have contact records for? And then it comes down to marketing. How much is the organization willing to invest in marketing the new credentialing program? If it's willing to put the money in, it can expect to get a higher rate of engagement, obviously. We then think about growth, and we are going to want to target a 20% growth rate per year for the first 3 years. So when a program is new, let's say there are 1,000 people who are in that professional role in the geographic region that we decide that we want to certify. Let's say it's within the United States. In that first year, we're going to want somewhere between 10 and 100 of those practitioners to apply for the certification. Let's say that we're going to invest heavily in marketing, that of that 1,000 practitioners that we have good data on, it turns out that 500 of them are members of the association. So the association has a good penetration of 50% of its industry. Let's say that we're going to invest in marketing. We've got good contact information for all 1,000 and 50% of them are strongly engaged. We're going to want to go for 10%. We're going to say 100 of those 1,000 people we want to apply for the certification in its first year. Year 2, we would want 120, etc. After the first 3 years, we're going to step down our growth targets to 5% growth per year. And in order to remain financially successful, a credentialing program that starts off making a net profit or being break even really needs to increase 5% per year in order to keep up with inflation and the rising costs of various services from vendors like test delivery and postage and everything. That growth can be in volume, as I mentioned before, or it can be in price point, or it can be a combination. But we basically need 5% growth in revenue per year just to stay on track with inflation. In terms of price point, we have a magic formula here that we use at Metacred for our various client associations whose credentialing programs we manage. And that is the exam fee for somebody who is applying for certification for the first time should be 1% of the average annual salary for the certified professional role. That tends to be an amount that can be borne and is psychologically acceptable to customers. And if a price point is set above that, there tend to be significantly fewer people applying for the certification. And if the exam fee is set significantly below that, that is essentially money that the association is leaving on the table. We find that up to 1% of the average annual salary of the professional role, the exam fee doesn't have much of an impact on the number of applicants. So in other words, if you set your exam fee at 0.5% of the average annual salary, you probably won't get many more applicants than if you set it at 1%. That, of course, needs to be localized, which means that if you are offering the certification program in multiple regions around the world, you do need to probably have different exam fees based on region, based on the economic development status per the World Bank for each country. And we want essentially that exam fee to be 1% of the applicant's average annual salary in their particular country. That should be the member rate. As a not-for-profit association with members, we typically will charge an additional amount for non-members to apply for the certification and to then recertify. And the rationale for that is membership dues are what were invested at the front end to develop the credentialing program. And by charging the differential a higher price for non-members, the investment of membership dues is recouped. Many times an association will find that potential applicants will first join the association in order to enjoy the member rate for the certification program's exam fee and then subsequently recertification fee. And that's a good thing because that keeps the person engaged on a number of levels and is good in terms of impact in the association's general mission as well. I mentioned that we need 5% growth. We typically encourage our clients to increase their exam fees 5% every year. That desensitizes customers from increases, so you don't realize 5 years later, oh my goodness, we haven't raised fees in 5 years, and in order to keep up with our increasing costs from vendors and operational costs and staff salaries and things like this, now we have to increase our certification exam fee by 25%, and then you have a hue and cry in opposition to that because it's sudden and unexpected. So we recommend every year a slight increase, about 5%, and then there tends not to be much pushback on that. Recertification, when a program is mature, let's say 5 or 10 years in, recertification should represent about 50% of the revenue for a credentialing program. So what we want is people not only to earn the credential initially, but to stay competent by continuing to enhance their knowledge, skill, and ability. So through continuing professional development, we want people to periodically get recertified, stay competent in the role, stay engaged. And additionally, other revenue sources can be things like charging an approved provider fee for organizations that provide education that satisfies eligibility requirements or recertification requirements, or simply prepares candidates for the exam topics. Institutional alliances, where an organization may, for example, send large numbers of candidates to earn the certification that your organization offers in exchange for various benefits such as swifter processing, the ability to pay in bulk, and things like this. Branded merchandise, things like caps with the certification logo on it, replacement certificates, digital badges, etc. All of these are potential sources of additional revenue streams for our credentialing program. Let's move over to the cost, the expense side of the analysis. The initial development of a certification program is significant. It runs from about $125,000 to $175,000 US dollars right now, based on the basics, depending on various of those decision points that we talked about before. So the big cost item is for personnel certification. We need to use psychometricians in order to perform some of the tasks to make our program legally defensible. And those psychometrician fees are very high. That accounts for most of that cost. These are things like a job analysis to define what competencies are required for the particular role, defining the specifications of the assessment, writing exam items, and then improving those and refining them, referencing them, building exam forms, beta testing those exam questions and forms, again, coming back and improving the draft exam items, setting the passing point or cut score for the exam. And then, as we discussed before, if we've decided to offer the program beyond our local region, things like localization, translation, and equating of the different language versions of the exam. Then, on usually an annual basis, but could be more or less frequently depending on candidate volume, we do things like item analysis, form analysis, and distractor analysis. On a continual basis, we should have subject matter experts drafting new exam items and an exam committee that is reviewing and refining those exam items so that we can periodically, in pace with the pace of change within that occupation, refresh the exam content, make sure that we don't have any dated items on the test, and then periodically do that whole job analysis, et cetera, process again to revalidate that we are assessing what we need to assess to ensure competence in the occupational role. Some of the other decision points that have an impact on our expenses are how we are going to assess competence. Are we going to go with multiple choice question tests, short answers, essays, matching games? Are we going to go with those in a written format? Are we going to go with oral exams? Are we going to pursue performance testing? Are we simply going to review and analyze applicants' portfolio of accomplishments to identify whether they have those competencies? All of these decisions have cost impacts as well as logistical operational impacts, as well as effectiveness impacts. So in an ideal world, we would, of course, assess an individual's performance on the job for an extended amount of time using multiple subject matter experts for that assessment in order to decide whether the individual is competent. That's a very expensive proposition. It can have privacy concerns, etc. On the other end of the spectrum, we have multiple choice question tests, which are very inexpensive to administer, are objective and quantifiable in terms of measuring the results. And do they get to the question of competence as well as a performance test? Maybe not, but actually in several studies over the past decade, it has been shown that a multiple choice test actually has a better reliability rating than oral tests and performance tests in the same subject, probably due to the subjectivity of the raters or judges. And so at the end of the day, for a number of reasons, many certification programs come back to offering multiple choice only for their assessments, for cost reasons as well as reliability reasons. and simply the logistics of administering those exams. Again, regardless of what method we choose, we also have to decide what platform we're going to use to deliver those assessments: paper, computer-based, oral, observational. In the medical fields, we often see OSCEs, or objective structured clinical exams, where there are different stations, each of which has a problem, and different judges. So for those who might still be tempted to consider doing performance testing or oral exams, you do need to build into your assessment processes the way to ensure that each judge is going to be consistent and objective. And that's really, really challenging. Many times so challenging that we end up going back to a multiple choice test. The accrediting organizations tend to look pretty closely at certification programs that use oral exams to ensure inter-rater reliability and things like this. But also it is, on the cost side, again, on the financial side, more expensive to offer an oral exam and fly in subject matter experts and have the day of meeting space, etc., than it is to send your candidate to a computer-based test center around the world. Also, when we're talking about an oral exam or a performance test, we really have to ask ourselves the hard question of what it is that we are assessing. In most types of oral exam or performance test, one of the main things that gets assessed at the end of the day is the candidate's charisma. Now, if in the job analysis, one of the skills that is required for competent practice in that occupational role are oral presentation and communication skills, then perhaps it is appropriate to have an oral exam so that we can assess those oral communication skills of the candidate. But if that's not what we are thinking that we are assessing, we should probably take a second look at whether we want to have an oral exam, because at the end of the day, the friendly, happy, positive attitude candidate tends to do better than the nervous one with an accent from a different language, etc. So there are lots of opportunities for the raters to inappropriately not be objective. Again, we look at where we are going to deliver the exam, whether the association is going to host the exam at its office, if it has brick and mortar locations, whether we're going to offer the exam at the end of a class that's related, or during a conference so that we can get our conference attendees distracted from attending the conference, and we can make sure that when they get to the exam, they're not thinking about the conference. I'm a little biased against that one, obviously. Whether we're going to send proctors, currently certified people, or people from association staff or from the test service provider to the candidate's office and deliver the test on a one-off basis. Whether we're going to offer the test through the internet, unproctored, or at secure test centers around the world through a partnership with a test service provider. All of these choices, again, have cost impacts, as do a number of other choices, such as how we're going to market it, as I mentioned before, whether we're going to invest in having a certification management system as a bolt-on to our underlying association management system, or as one of the modules in our AMS, or if we don't have an AMS, are we in Excel spreadsheets and the additional staff time that might require and additional chance of human error, but on the other hand, lower cost of technology. And finally, is the association going to manage its certification activities itself and hire certification staff to do so, usually at a minimum for a new program, a certification director and a certification coordinator to lead the program and work with the committees and to handle all the customer service and exam administration and results reporting and all of this. Obviously, those two positions themselves cost a lot of money, as does all of the IT that is typically used in credentialing. And if we want to deliver our exams at secure test sites, all of the big test service providers that have thousands of test sites around the world have an annual minimum that is hard to get to as a new program, or for an occupational role that doesn't have a lot of total people in it. And so many associations choose to deliver their certification programs through an association management company or other aggregator of those certification activities, which can, through the sharing of infrastructure, lower the operational costs significantly, as well as insulating the certifying organization from some of the legal risks such as HR issues, and also avoid those minimums with the test service providers. So there are some economic advantages to using an aggregator or AMC to deliver certification. Lastly, we're going to touch on legal defensibility, the risk exposure of credentialing programs, because there are financial impacts associated with it. So what happens when something goes wrong, right? We issue a certification to somebody who's in, let's say, construction of some kind. That individual that we've certified then causes harm to property or person, and the individual or the organization that was harmed then comes after whom? They'll go after the person who committed the harm, right? The individual certified person. But they're also going to look at whoever issued that person a credential. Typically, the perception is that associations have deep pockets, and so most lawyers worth their salt will, and most insurance companies that are going to direct who gets sued are going to go after the certifying organization in addition to the certified person if that person commits harm. So how do we minimize the risk associated with that? There are three basic principles, plus in the US, certainly a fourth, and arguably elsewhere in the world. The first principle is always have a rational basis for every decision made. Every decision should flow from that purpose statement. Every decision should have the rational basis rather than being arbitrary. So cut score or passing point is a great example. How do we decide what the passing point is? Do we say, hey, it's 75% because we like that number and that's what we were taught in high school? Or do we do a cut score study where we have a range of practitioners actually assess the difficulty of each exam item, and through a calculation say, okay, this exam form, this one, the passing point is going to be 68. That other exam form is a little easier based on the items on it, so that one's going to be a 72. The formal method of setting the cut score is the only one that is legally defensible. And if a certification program arbitrarily selects a passing point, it becomes vulnerable to attack, either by candidates who fail and challenge how that passing point was set, or worse yet, by the victims of harm caused by a candidate who passed the exam. Secondly, the program, the organization should avoid undue influence. This means that core certification decisions, such as what the passing point is, what the eligibility requirements are, what the recertification requirements are, whether an individual satisfies any of those requirements, how the program is marketed. All of these core certification decisions should be made by the certification body, not by the general membership organization. And there are often times when the general goals of an association might be slightly in conflict with the purpose of its credentialing program. And it's essential that before those conflicts arise, the operational and procedural arrangements are in place to define who makes the core certification decisions and the fact that undue influence is going to be avoided. Lastly, you got to do what you say you're going to do. If you say that you are going to be, issuing certification to people who get a 72 or higher on exam form B, and somebody gets a 71, but they're a board member and you really want them to pass because that'll help you with your marketing, that would be a bad choice. So we want to always do what we say we are going to do. And lastly, in the US, due to antitrust law, we have to firewall off education from certification. That is to say, anybody who has seen the exam items in the certification exam item bank cannot develop or teach educational programs that are intended to lead to certification if the association charges for those educational courses. There are lots of layers and subtleties within that. There, of course, are standards around this that we'll get to in a second, but essentially, you've got to make sure that your committee members, volunteer leaders, as well as your staff are firewalled. So those who have access to the certification exam items do not develop the curriculum, do not teach the classes that are on the education side leading to certification. And that is essentially to insulate the certifying organization from being sued for antitrust violations by other providers of education who claim that it would be anti-competitive for the association to offer education if that education was based on the test, so teaching to the test, because those other education providers don't have access to the test. Okay, so I mentioned a couple times now the accreditation for certification programs. There are basically two organizations that offer accreditation of general certification programs. There are other organizations that specialize in accrediting certification programs in a particular occupational area, like nursing or engineering. And there are other organizations that accredit specific types of programs in specific regions, like the EU's UEMS CESMA accredits medical specialty certification programs in Europe, which are called European diplomas. But in general, the two organizations are the NCCA, National Commission for Certifying Agencies, which was started in the 1970s by a charter of the US Congress in order to combat against nursing specialty diploma mills that lacked legitimacy. And more recently, ISO, and in the US, its implementer ANSI, have gotten into the game with standard ANSI ISO IEC 17024. Both of those two are the accreditation of certification programs and are very similar in many ways. There are subtle differences, including how much it costs and whether there's an on-site visit as part of the accreditation process, but they're similar in terms of the guidance of how to run a good credentialing program. And so we recommend that if you are developing a new or managing an existing credentialing program, certification program specifically, you get these standards. If you're not currently accredited to either of them, that's okay. It's still a good template to follow of how to build and run a good quality certification program. Finally, there's actually it's no longer NOCA, it's ICE, the Institute for Credentialing Excellence, which is the parent organization of the National Commission for Certifying Agencies, or NCCA. It also has a standard that is joint with ANSI on certificate programs. We talked already a little bit about the global market, and one of the key questions that has a financial impact is how we're going to deliver the exam, and whether we're using the computer-based test centers of a partner test service provider like Prometric or Pearson or PSI, or whether we are going to offer the exam only when we do an international conference or when we're exhibiting in collaboration with an affiliated society abroad, etc. One of the key aspects to keep an eye on is intellectual property. Different countries have very different standards of intellectual property protection. The US is one of the strictest, and if the certification program is going to be offered in multiple countries, it is essential to engage an intellectual property attorney and understand how to best protect your property, both in terms of exam content as well as preventing cheating and things like this. In summary, in order to be sure that our certification program, certificate program, or accreditation program, or for government organizations, our licensing program, is a cash cow rather than a draining distraction, we need to make sure that every decision point is aligned with the strategic plan of the organization, the purpose statement of the credential, and our financial plan. We need to make sure that we've done a good, accurate market analysis and have all of the data that we need in order to understand our universe of potential applicants, whether there's a global scope of practice, whether there's a global language of practice, and how we are going to assess competence. We need then to set the price point appropriately. Again, we recommend 1% of the average annual salary for that region, for that occupational role. And we need to take advantage of all the different potential revenue streams beyond that initial exam fee, whether it's recertification, preparatory materials, replacement certificates, recognition items, etc. You know, we may give a lapel pin and a certificate up front and then charge additional fees for other recognition items like a coffee mug, etc. All of these are potential sources of revenue to help offset the significant costs of running a credentialing program. But when we do that planning in a strategic, conscious way, and we operate the program diligently and invest appropriately in marketing, credentialing programs tend to be stable, positive contributors to the association's bottom line. And at this time, we are almost done, but if there are any questions, we can take them now. And if there are additional questions past our time, of course, you can email me at jdmr@metacred.com or connect with me on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn profile is linkedin.com/in/credentialing. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we have a couple more seconds. Let's see. I don't think there are any questions. And again, if there are any questions, you can either email David or you can email webinars@webcourseworks.com and we'll pass it along to David. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be sending a follow-up email to all attendees with a link to the webinar recording. So that should come out sometime this week, early next week, unless things change. But yeah, happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Thanks, David.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you, everybody.